terrorist drive-by shooting at IDF outpost, IDF base, drive-by shooting.
If they could withhold him from helping Israel to annex any parts of Judea and Samaria, hey, that's going to be better for the cause.
Maybe Bibi Netanyahu didn't want a Palestinian state, a terrorist Palestinian state, alongside Jewish enclave.
This is the Israel Guys.
Welcome to the Israel Guys, where we believe that in a world of fake news, you should connect to the true and authentic stories of Israel. Guys, we do not have any proof, but we just have this little feeling that our message might be getting a little bit squashed out there on our main platforms, something also known as maybe YouTube. We don't know. But anyways, I just say that to tell you that you should definitely subscribe, and if you enjoy watching on YouTube, go for that. Get the conversation going, comments. But you can also go over and subscribe on Rumble. You can download the Israel Guys app. You can check us out on all the social media platforms at the Israel Guys. We just want to make sure that you are getting our message. And if you haven't been seeing us, or maybe we disappear from YouTube one day, just know, head over to Rumble or just find us on the internet, also at theisraelguys.com. Make sure you subscribe because you don't want to miss out on any of the incredible content that we're putting out every single week. Today's program, 2 parts, guys. First part, the IDF in a daring and bold mission, taking out 3 murderous terrorists in the heart of Nablus, in the heart of Samaria, falsely known as the West Bank. And part 2 is, if you thought our previous program a few months back about President Trump's relationship with Israel and his policy on Israel was controversial, he did a groundbreaking interview. He said some very interesting things, and we did a show on it, caught a lot of flack. But if you had questions about that or disagreed with that, today's program, second half of today's program, may clear up some of that confusion and possibly disagreement, because we're going to talk more about President Trump and also former U.S. Ambassador David Friedman to Israel and his new book that he just released called Sledgehammer. You don't want to miss it.
Luke, were you saying that you think we could be being censored right now?
Shh, I didn't want to.
You don't use that word.
Yeah.
Okay, we're not allowed to use that word. You know, guys, the more I see the true problems of this world, I'm boiling it down, and I'm gonna narrow it into Israel. The problems that face Israel, I'm gonna narrow it down to international pressure. And Luke, we're gonna get into this a little bit, because international pressure is just a big wrecking ball that wrecks this nation. And what I'm really is attempting to wreck this beautiful nation of Israel. And I'm gonna boil it down here for you. 3 terrorists. Why are there 3 terrorists attacking Israel? Well, I'll tell you right now, the current administrations of the world are empowering hostile terrorists to attack Israelis. And why am I boiling it down to international pressure? Well, it's just a fact. The enemies of Israel are emboldened when the international world pressures Israel to be nice to them. You get that? So there's this thing called these Palestinian people who are at war with the nation of Israel. Drive them into the sea, and Israel is made to be weak by the internationals that are pressuring Israel to not fully defend themselves. Yep. We talked about we're going to have a show coming out here soon about the security fences and the breaches in the security fences. Be sure and be watching out for that. It's an incredible thing. We're about to release that
on location. On location.
Exactly.
Josh, last couple of weeks there's been shooting attacks, multiple times, all around the area where we're sitting right now. Mount of Blessing, northern Samaria, where we are. But there's been reports, terrorist drive-by shooting at IDF outpost, IDF base, drive-by shooting, terrorists open fire at IDF soldiers, and it's happened a bunch of times.
Right.
So the IDF and Israel's intelligence, being as good as they are, they figure out who these terrorists are. They get in a Arab taxi and an Arab vehicle, full military gear. These guys are not undercover, but they go in undercover vehicles, go into the heart of Nablus, biblical Shechem, which is just below the mountain from here, less than a mile away from where we're sitting. They drive in, and they eliminated these 3 terrorists.
And let me tell you, they did eliminate. They're done. They annihilated the enemy of Israel that attempted. Thank God it was just an attempt. But these guys were emboldened to attack Israel.
Which I can tell you that when Israel eliminates someone like that, that means they've done their intelligence, they've done their research, and they know that these guys are very, very bad dudes, and they need to be taken out. Okay,
Well, of course,
that's
if
what
you're
happens.
shooting at soldiers
They're
and
not.
civilians.
This is not a 15-year-old that tried to stab a Jew or threw rocks or something like that, which is also horrible. But these guys are serious terrorists.
No, they have machine guns, and they're shooting at soldiers and civilians. Prime Minister Bennett says this: our forces have proven today, guys, this was just happened yesterday, so Bennett's just releasing it. Proven today, he released this yesterday, once again, that there is no immunity for terrorists. Whoever harms us will be harmed. You know, that's the kind of Israel I want to see. I want to see a strong Israel, an Israel that's able to defend themselves and be proud to defend themselves. And that's the nation of Israel that we need to see. And not the international pressure that's constantly condemning Israel and telling Israel you have no right to defend yourself. That's nonsense and has to be stopped in the international world. And I can guarantee you, you're probably by the time you're watching this right now, there's already reports on all the leftist news condemning Israel for taking out these three
I can
terrorists.
guess what the headline says.
Yeah.
Three
Well,
Palestinians killed in clashes with Israeli military. If there's not a headline, at least one out there like that, I would be very surprised.
Yeah, we're going to be totally shocked. Of course, all the headlines, BBC to Al Jazeera, you name it, all of them, even the New York Times may have headlines saying, just reversing the situation. IDF shoots Palestinians. Just totally negating the fact that they're terrorists and they're enemies of Israel that tried to shoot soldiers. They're just going to leave out those fairly important details, guys. And this, you know what I find interesting? Israel is strong. And let me tell you why I know they're strong. There's a biblical reference. I just got to remember, bring this up just for a moment. There's this story of Jonathan and his armor bearer. Well, what did they do? The quick story, you guys probably are familiar with it. They asked the garrison at the top if they come down or if should they go up, right? And they said, well, if they ask us to come up, they're scared, right? Because they're entering in. Well, I'm telling you what, Israel today is living in the same spirit of Jonathan. They went in. They attacked. They went inside. Literally, these soldiers, they go inside. They're not waiting for them to come out. Mm-hmm. They are attacking deep inside. And I'm telling you, if you're an enemy of Israel, you ought to be scared. Enemies of Israel should be scared at the fact that the IDF, Israel, is a strong nation. And if they have backing, they're going to be stronger, of course, but they will take out terrorists. And I believe the words of Bennett are timely, and the enemies of Israel should beware that if you choose to attack and to kill and steal and try to harm the Jewish people, you will be harmed. And that's just the fact. Guys, we're going to show a quick video here of what happens. What's the aftermath? What happens when and anywhere else in the world, if there's terrorists, usually normal people rejoice when terrorists are taken out, okay? What happens in the Palestinian areas, the Fatah-ruled areas, when these Palestinian terrorists are taken out? What happens? Well, let's just watch this video real quick. We'll come back. Okay, guys, so is that normal? If you guys, I'm assuming, have been to funerals. Is that something that do you normally just take out your AKs and just, I'm telling you, hundreds of shots. You just saw it in the video. Hundreds, that's not thousands of rounds of ammo went straight up into the air. You know, I would be slightly concerned if I was at a funeral like that. You know, there's this rule that whatever goes up must come back down. I mean, literally, that's slightly dangerous.
Maybe we could hope that they were firing blanks. But
well, we could hope. But
no guarantees, especially knowing the area we're living in.
Guaranteed they're not shooting. And here's the big problem is I live right above that. Like, Luke and I are... They're shooting...
Josh, not only that, but we went into Nablus and we documented it all on camera. And you guys should go watch that. It came out a couple of months ago. Go back on our show. I watched the video where we went to Nablus. But Nablus Governor Ibrahim Ramadan declared a day of mourning and a general strike in the city for these three murders. And when we went to Nablus, every single corner, every single block had posters honoring shaheeds. Shaheeds are martyrs, honoring these guys. And that's the general atmosphere. I'm not going to say that 100% of Palestinians support terrorism, but they've been brainwashed, and the general, the general consensus is that when a terrorist attack happens, they all come together and rejoice. Okay. And that's the reality of life on the ground here. Josh, speaking of shaheeds and martyrs, we have to talk about another guy, and that is Mahmoud Abbas, who also honored shaheeds and martyrs, but not only did that, but tried to fool former President Donald Trump into believing that he was the good guy, and Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel at the time, was the bad guy. Okay?
Well, I think this is a big story, Luke, and I'm excited to get into it because this is the first I've heard of this. This is like news hot off the press from former Ambassador David Friedman.
And you guys gave us a lot of flack for our program that we put out a couple of months ago about President Trump and just trying to look at the negative aspects towards Trump's policies toward Israel. Don't click off the video yet, okay? You need to hear this. You're going to be encouraged by this, okay? And also, you're going to leave you with a few questions still at the end of this. Questions
Luke,
that we still have.
Flack or not, we guys, we just really have to tell you what we feel straight on the ground here. That we can't change it because
and it's the fact, and we just believe that the truth is important, okay? But hang on, you want to hear the rest of this, okay? Former U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman just released a book. The book is called Sledgehammer: How Breaking with the Past Brought Peace to the Middle East. Josh, I've met David Friedman personally. Regarding Israel, like a U.S. politician and diplomat towards Israel, he is a guy, obviously he's one of the few that I've met, but he's a guy that I respect a lot. Very strong leader.
He's the best you can get when it comes to Israeli politics.
He was an amazing guy. And I'm planning on ordering this book ASAP and reading it because I'm really fascinated. Okay, but he gives the ambassador gives an inside look to how President Trump looked at and handled America's policy toward Israel. And we have, even though the book's just coming out, there's a lot of interviews and articles and excerpts coming out. We have a glimpse into what that is, okay? Ambassador David Friedman, he claims that Trump was never planning to give the Palestinians a state. This is according to an interview that he did with JNS, okay? With this interview with Eli Kohanim from JNS, and also former diplomat with or envoy with the U.S. State Department, I believe. David Friedman says that President Trump understood that Israel has only, quote, held on to land, end quote, when it was essential for the country's security and where, quote, where the land represents the biblical history of the Jewish people. So basically saying Israel's not going to compromise on their security, okay? So if we give land to the Palestinians and that compromises Israel's security, we can't do that. And also biblical history, which is a lot of Judea and Samaria, a.k.a. West Bank, biblical heartland, right? Now, there's still some questions with that because we'll get to it. But according to Friedman, Trump's Peace for Prosperity, which was popularly known as the deal of the century, the plan had a lot of new territorial dimensions to it that had never been seen before in any former peace plans that U.S. presidents had put forth to Israel. But it gave the Palestinians a lot of territory inside Judea and Samaria for their own state, okay? But it also gave most of the Jewish communities, aka settlements, to Israel. And they were to annex those settlements and apply sovereignty to them. They would become a part of Israel. The big problem is that it also left a lot of them as isolated enclaves, which would be surrounded by Palestinian territory. And a really good example of that is basically where the studio is sitting right here on Har Bracha, which is the Mount of Blessing. This was going to be one of the most isolated enclaves, like extremely isolated. We can't get into the details right now, just don't have time. But it was going to be completely cut off. And also, there's a few Arab villages around us that tend to be kind of radical and violent. And things would not get better if the territory was given completely over to the Palestinian Authority, right?
Luke, I've got a question here because you said that former Ambassador David Friedman said that they didn't want to give, they weren't going to create a Palestinian state, but they were going to create they're going to give a lot of land to Palestinians. You gotta
quote,
help me out here.
Friedman, this is a direct quote from David Friedman. He says, quote, would they have a state in the traditional sense? No, they would not. Okay. So
you're saying they're going to have a land, but they're not going to have. They're not going to be self.
So my analysis of this, and this is just my gut feeling, is that it's just like he said. They would not have a state in the traditional sense, not like former U.S. presidents and Yasser Arafat wanted to create, where they're just going to give them a huge chunk of land, create a nation. Like the plan, the deal of the century had very specific things.
Demilitarized was one of the big ones,
right? And making sure that the Palestinians would, not be attacking Israel. The problem is between the really good language that was in the deal of the century, Peace to Prosperity plan, and the actual boots on the ground practical aspect, it could not have happened because you just can't give territory over to the Palestinian Authority, and then, boom, they're demilitarized, they don't have guns, and they're automatically not going to attack Israel. It just can't happen like that. Okay?
Luke, my second question is how does this relate with Barak Ravid? We just talked about this the other week when he put a big bash out against Trump, basically with Netanyahu, and how the whole thing was a big bash, and actually Trump ended up saying a lot of things good towards Abbas. Now, how does that relate to what?
So there's an interesting story. The interesting story that David Friedman tells in his book, and obviously we're talking about the bombshell interview that former President Trump did with very liberal, left-leaning senior Israeli journalist here in Israel. Some right-wingers don't even call him a journalist; they just basically say he's a activist. But Trump used language like Mahmoud Abbas was a father figure to me, and he was such a nice guy. So things like that. And then he also said that Bibi Netanyahu really did not want peace, and that was very bombshell after Trump's time in office and the incredible pro-Israel policies that he had. So David Friedman says that before Trump's visit to Israel, when they moved the embassy in 2017, the Palestinians tried to play a really brilliant, like a chess move, okay? They had this very respected businessman and a philanthropist and an active player in the region who used to be a Bibi Netanyahu supporter, okay, Israel's prime minister at the time. But then he had a falling out with Netanyahu, so I guess he wanted to get back at him. So the Palestinians, they got him to go to President Trump and tell him this story. And his name was Ron Lauder. He isn't named in the book, but at least according to the news sources that I read, they're pretty confident that this is the guy. His name's Ron Lauder. And he told Trump that the Palestinians, quote, were prepared to make peace with Israel on very favorable terms, even to include conceding all of Jerusalem to Israeli sovereignty and giving up the return of refugees. But the problem was that Bibi Netanyahu was unwilling to negotiate peace. Lauder informed the president that he needed to pressure Netanyahu and embrace Abbas in order to make a deal. Trump bought it. He was going to put the screws to Netanyahu to force the deal. End quote. Okay? Now, we know, and hopefully you know, that nothing could be further from the truth. Mahmoud Abbas would never agree to give up Jerusalem and give up the idea of the return of refugees. And also, it's not true that Bibi Netanyahu did not want to make peace. Okay? Complete fabrication, complete lie. But the problem is, Trump did buy it. So,
well, Luke, let me just say this. Yeah. That's a very popular Arab technique in politics. Is lying is really not off the table. Well, because you can lie as much as you want as long as it has to do with favoring your cause and actually seeing your cause succeed. So creating a Palestinian state, wiping Israel into the sea, if they could convince President Trump at the time that this was going to be favorable toward that cause, if they could withhold him from helping Israel to annex any parts of Judea and Samaria, hey, that's going to be better for the cause. So just to lay some background, that's totally cool with the Muslim-rooted politics.
Right.
So that's what the guy's
former ambassador David Friedman, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, caught wind of this, and he knew exactly what was going on because, like we said, he is a man that was in the U.S. administration that knew more about this region, the truth of what was going on, than anybody else that we know of. So he went to Netanyahu, told him this, and he said, we're going to have to do something about it. So he said, I think you should make a video showing exactly who Mahmoud Abbas is, and that's exactly what they did. They made a video showing all of his speeches, probably in Arabic, where he's calling for Israel's to be wiped off the face of the map, calling for terrorist attacks, things like that. And when Trump came to Israel, I believe this was in 2017, sat down with Netanyahu. They showed him the video, and then they said, and Friedman says in his book, quote, with that we watched 2 minutes of Abbas honoring terrorists, extolling violence, and vowing to never accept anything less than Israel's total defeat. Abbas ranted that the blood of every shaheed, literally, which means martyr, but also a terrorist, was holy and would be avenged. So after watching the video, Trump said, quote, wow, is that the same guy I met in Washington last month? He seemed like such a sweet, peaceful guy. So there you have the background on Trump's attitude towards Mahmoud Abbas. So then after that, we all know that Trump went to Bethlehem to meet with Mahmoud Abbas, and he really called him out for who he was and was very bold in telling him exactly what he thought and not allowing him to place the blame on Israel for the failed peace process, okay? So what does all this mean? Because I hope you're not confused at this point. We want to bring this together for you because there's still some things that are very mystifying about this. Because after Trump learns who Mahmoud Abbas is, goes to Bethlehem, calls him out, and does not let him put the blame off on someone else, just 2 months ago, we have his interview with Barak Ravid, where he calls Mahmoud Abbas a father figure and such a nice guy again, right? So what does all this mean? And then also we know the story from Ravid, and Friedman brings more clarity to when the Abraham Accords were, or the deal of the century, the deal of the century was announced at the White House. Netanyahu immediately made a speech and said, we are ready to embrace this. We want to take steps to move towards applying Israeli sovereignty, because he thought, this is my opportunity, right? And then Friedman does say that Trump said that he felt that Netanyahu was too hasty in pushing for sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, and he basically forced Israel to put the brakes on it. And then that leads to his comments to Barak Ravid in 2021, where he said, quote, I thought the Palestinians were impossible and the Israelis would do anything to make peace and a deal. I found that not to be true. Bibi did not want to make a deal. I wish he would have said he didn't want to make a deal, because a lot of people devoted a lot of work. But I don't think Bibi would have ever made a deal. Maybe Bibi Netanyahu didn't want a Palestinian state, a terrorist Palestinian state, alongside Jewish enclaves in the West Bank.
Yeah.
And that's when he went on to talk about Mahmoud Abbas being such a nice guy. So there's still, these things are a little bit mystifying. Why is Trump, after his time in office, coming out and bashing Israel, bashing Netanyahu, and reverting to his original thought process as to who Mahmoud Abbas was? Okay, so key takeaways from this, because we want to be really, really clear on this, guys, and you have to hear us. Please don't take our comments out of context. Like I said, you guys responded. Some of you guys were upset about our earlier program about bringing all this to light about former President Donald Trump.
Luke, I just want to remember the former program we did, we talked about, first off, and again today, we're going to talk about it just the same as we did then. Trump did a lot of amazing things. You can't find a better president for the state of Israel, and the most favorable president in American history to the state of Israel was President Trump. Right. We just said it.
And so that's true. Right. And so that what we're saying now does not take away from any of those things. Recognizing the Golan Heights, the Pompeo Doctrine, which declared that building and settlement in Judea and Samaria is not illegal per se, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the Abraham Accords, none of that. What he's saying now does not take away from any of this. And again, I'm not saying that if he became president right now, he would have an awful policy toward Israel. I don't believe that. Okay, but we do have to look at his peace plan that he wanted to enact for Israel and the Palestinians, and also the Palestinian state that he wanted to establish. We have to look at those details, and we have to be very careful about our attitude.
And that's currently where I'm concerned, Luke, is where it would go. Because now we know there's a little bit of conflict between Bibi Netanyahu and Trump, and all the details, and the boss now inside that figure. Now, those three political things, with the being a little bit off, what could happen? You never know what could really fall out in those relationships with. And listen, the communities of Israel, the people of Israel are affected by these decisions. So that's where our concern is what would happen. No, we can't have. And honestly, that's one awful part of the whole peace plan was enclaves in the middle of a Palestinian, even if you don't call it state, Palestinian area, that's still a no-go. And if you, as a Christian Zionist, that's a no-go. And we're never going to say that that's good just because Trump said that it was good. No, we have a biblical mandate to stand with the people of Israel, and we're not going to downplay that mandate because of some political thing that's happening in our world today.
Right. And again,
we have to stand with the communities of Judea and Samaria.
Again, that does not take away from his amazing policies that he did have for Israel, and hopefully would have again if he were elected. But end of the day, maybe Trump does not still want to create a Palestinian state in the traditional sense of the idea, but he does want to give away large parts of the biblical heartland to the Palestinians, okay? That is one fact that we know for sure, and turn many of the Jewish settlements into isolated enclaves. We looked at the map. I read the, whatever it was, 180 pages of the deal of the century plan, okay? I wanted to be real clear on this. We know that to be for a fact. And where we're sitting right now, being one of those isolated, probably one of the more isolated Jewish enclaves. Okay.
And look, can we just bring this in perspective really quick? Remember all that shooting we saw just earlier?
Yeah.
The enclave would be right in the middle.
Less than a mile. Yeah.
That.
Less than a mile from that.
I'm sorry.
Where that video
President Trump has not visited this location and probably is not aware of that situation. So I'm sure his intentions are good.
And
the facts are just a totally different story on the ground here.
And the other thing we know is that he does seem to have a biased view of who the terrorist Mahmoud Abbas really is. Yeah. We also told you exactly who Mahmoud Abbas was in a previous video. Go check out the facts.
Hey, look again. All those shooters, Fatah, Abbas. Yep. He's the head commander. Yes. That's all connected.
Okay, guys. So our encouragement is always just keep a balanced perspective on U.S. policy towards Israel. Never compromise on any plans or peace deals that call for Israel to give away any parts of their land. No percentage of giving away land here in Israel is okay. Guys, let us know what you think down in the comments below. We love to hear from you. And remember, go over there and subscribe on Rumble if you want to watch over there. Check us out on all social media platforms at The Israel Guys or theisraelguys.com. Remember to tune out the fake news and tune into what is actually happening here in the land of Israel. We'll be back next week here at The Israel Guys. Hi guys, thanks so much for watching. 2 quick things before you go. 1, smash that subscribe button. Make sure you hit the notifications bell so you don't miss out on any more of our content. Secondly, if you want to help us produce more stories and authentic truth straight from Israel's heartland, you can do so at patreon.com/theisraelguys or at our very own website. It's theisraelguys.com. Both links are in the description below.